The Russian government's deniable use of rogues, businessmen, enthusiasts, mercenaries, and political technologists confounded policymakers as Moscow waged a covert invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Did the war in Crimea and Donbas reveal the Kremlin's hybrid war playbook, or did Moscow quickly lose control over the forces it had unleashed? What's clear is that the international community has dramatically misunderstood the very nature of this war and was unprepared for the Kremlin's sudden and brutal escalation to full-scale war in 2022. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on podcast platforms as well. And please do like and subscribe. And it's especially important these days to comment on the videos as well to help new people discover them. We've also got links to verified Ukrainian charities in the description of the video. Some are humanitarian, some obviously are more military in nature. Please do check those out. And if you like the channel, do consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. Anna Arutunyan is a Russian-American journalist, analyst, and author. She is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Her acclaimed research and analysis focuses on Putin's volunteer militias, the pro-Russian insurgency in Donbas, and the war it escalated into in eastern Ukraine. And today we're going to be discussing an absolutely fascinating book that she's brought out in 2022. It's called Hybrid Warriors, Proxies, Freelancers, and Moscow's Struggle for Ukraine. Anna, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. It's great to meet you. Great to be here.
And what prompted me here is I heard an absolutely fascinating discussion at Pushkin House where we sort of explored some of the details of the book. And I thought it would be an absolutely ideal topic for the audience, even though the details that you're discussing have kind of been overshadowed by the sheer scale of the monstrous suffering of the full-scale war. Why do you think it's still really important to go back and try to understand the processes, motivations, mistakes, miscalculations that actually led towards it?
I think that when the full-scale invasion started, there was obviously a great deal of shock, horror, grief, and I think a lot of analysts, a lot of people who had been watching this unravel, understandably pivoted to the conclusion that this was inevitable, that Putin had been planning this all along, and that we should have, done something sooner. And tracking this conflict from its very initial stages on the ground, watching the insurgency develop on the ground in eastern Ukraine that the Kremlin then exploited, what struck me throughout, and I still hold to this, is that none of this was inevitable. Putin is a leader who did not wake up on the day he was born planning to take over the world. He's a leader whose chief characteristic is, very often dithering, changing his mind, maneuvering this way and that, taking ages to make up his mind and make a decision. And I think in the end, what happened with this conflict is he made a series of choices that ended up boxing him in. None of those choices, however, made from 2013 onward, necessarily had to lead to this. He had all sorts of things that he could have done. And I think that why this is important to remember, why it's so important to go back and look at the origins of this conflict and remember that, is that going forward, we need to avoid making the same mistake Putin did and boxing us into inevitability. And this is, I think, why it's so crucial to look at all of the complexities that started in 2014. Some of them are relevant today and some of them are not. But that said, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what went on, some of it deliberate, some of it not.
And you make a really interesting point, and we see a lot of this in the last 2 years, and that is people presuming to know the mind of Putin. Whereas if you look at the detailed events, it's quite clear that many of his inner circle were unaware of the full-scale plans to invade Ukraine. Many were caught on the hop, as it were, by that decision. And even commentators and analysts who normally I'd sort of listen to them go, yeah, you're really telling me something about the system which is from the inside. Many of them were saying, no, no, of course, it makes no rational sense for the full-scale war. People like Viktor Shenderovich, other bloggers that I watched, like Ilya Varlamov, all of them were saying, no, no, well, okay, you know, they predicted other stuff with an extraordinary degree of accuracy. And on this one, they were actually completely wrong. I don't know where you sort of sit in that, but trying to know the mind of Putin is really perhaps claiming to have more power in the world, I think, than analysts actually have.
I mean, absolutely. Inevitably, I fall into the same pattern that I warn people against. I like to think that I do this with, a great degree of, let's say, um, attention to detail. I try to listen to specifically what he says at any given point. Um, but obviously, going into that, we have to acknowledge two things. We can't know what he's thinking and feeling fully. That said, as analysts, sometimes we have to make a call, alas. And sometimes we're going to be wrong and sometimes we're going to be right. Now, in Hybrid Warriors, there is a chapter towards the end, the last chapter, where I actually kind of retrace uh, what I consider to be Putin's thinking over the last 20 years. And I think that with that comes a great deal of grievance and a sense of inferiority that I think ultimately played into this, a sense of looming fear and a sense of looming impotence. The misunderstanding of one's own agency, the belief that your enemies are much more powerful than they really are, and ascribing, these intentions to them that they never really had. But that said, given the way NATO was behaving and given the signals that were sent by states that Russia considered to be its adversaries, it only played into this paranoia, alas. Um, Now, I think that my personal view, what happened in the last months prior to the invasion, I was in Moscow at the time, and I was watching this very, very closely. Obviously, I was talking to um, people who are the close to the Kremlin, people who were supporters of the Novorossiya project, who were supporters of the pro-Russian insurgency in Russia. And I mean, I felt that up to the end, I don't quite think Putin had made up his mind until the very end. And that would explain why the military was so unprepared, why this completely blindsided his own closest circle of advisors. Nobody had expected this because this was just, there was no sense to it. In some ways, he was winning by what he could have done, what in fact what we were all expecting, was that he would recognize the independence of the Donbas, of the Donetsk and Lugansk, so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. That would have put him in that would kind of in a repeat of what happened in 2008 in Georgia, and that would have put him in a position where, okay, we're going to claim these well, not claim, not even officially, and then wait and see what happens. And then if Ukraine moved to retake them by force, then Russia had the buildup of its military on the border, and then we would have seen. But Ukraine would have been unlikely to do so. So, a lot of this just simply didn't make sense. And I think another very important thing, and forgive me if I kind of anticipate your next question, but I think that what's important to remember is that in 2014, when all of these events started after the annexation of Crimea, there was a great deal of influx of volunteers. There was a great deal of support from Russia's security community. A lot of people were calling for an invasion, for Putin to send troops and, openly annex the eastern Ukrainian these areas. He didn't do that, despite the fact that had he done it at the time, he would have likely succeeded. He was in a much better place to do that in 2014 when the Ukrainian government and its army were in disarray. Now, for some reason, he waited 8 years and did this at a time when Ukraine had militarized, and what he's achieved, well, except for pushing Ukraine further into the arms of the West, we're not really sure.
And of course, I mean, I'm not a military strategist, but I have talked to some who suggest that had there been a coherent um, military strategy, Russia could have pushed down through the south, probably taken Odessa, and then joined it up with the territories of Moldova. And that would make a strategic sense because you'd have control over, the coastal route. You'd have Ukrainians' economy really in a stranglehold, not being able to export grain. That would have put him militarily and economically in a far strong position. So it doesn't seem that the strategy is really driven by intense military planning or wargaming. It's perhaps driven by a set of information that people have fed him because perhaps they felt that that's what he wanted to hear. So how far do you think the sort of informational bubble and the institutionalized sycophancy that his system has created is part of the problem?
I think it's, yeah, I mean, it is inevitably part of any late stage autocratic rule. And I think the psychological effects on both the person in power and especially on his closest surrounding are immense, and they play out in certain patterns. I think Putin in some ways is unique in that he is particularly indecisive. And this actually creates more paranoia and more fear than it I would wager than need be. I mean, I think certainly being misinformed by his own security services about Ukraine being in a state where they would be able to take Kiev and institute regime change within a matter of a few weeks. Certainly that played into the initial aims. But I think what's also important is that just as Russia's goals, or just as the Kremlin's goals changed throughout the 8 years since 2014, I think they also changed since the invasion. If you look at what he was doing in the early days of February 2022, uh, to what he's doing now, these are different goals, and they're very much based on what he thinks he can get at the moment on the ground. In other words, the idea that he wants to win at all costs by taking Kiev and capturing all of Ukraine, that might have been a goal in early 2022. I don't really see that as a goal now. And this is both a weakness and a strength of Putin, that he tends to maneuver and change his objectives as the situation develops on the ground. Now, the strength in that is a certain degree of flexibility. The problem with that, however, is that when to do that, he keeps his objectives, as stated, deliberately vague. Denazification and demilitarization, what does that mean? And when are we going to attain it? People will start asking. Indeed, that's what happened with the Prigozhin mutiny when he directly started, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, directly started asking these questions. And this causes a lot of this is potentially incredibly risky because when people start asking these questions and they start wondering, do you actually know what you're doing? Do you actually have a goal? And are you realistic about our ability to achieve it?
And that's interesting with Prigozhin because, in the end, Putin seems to have known how to deal with him in a way. I guess he also understands Kadyrov because they've got a certain relationship for a number of years, which has its tensions, I'm sure, but is mutually beneficial. So in the end, I guess either the sort of the mafia instinct or whatever took over, and he eliminated Prigozhin. Um, But this indecision on how to deal with, say, Zelensky, how to deal with NATO, would you say that perhaps he doesn't quite understand those institutions? So you mentioned NATO earlier, and of course, the propaganda narrative is that, NATO so-called expansion is a provocation, etc., etc. Whereas you could equally argue the opposite, that Putin, with his indecisiveness and caution, if he's faced with a very clear and unambiguous show of force by NATO, if NATO were to say in 2014, for instance, right, this, we're not going to put up with this, and this is what we're going to do if, if anything further happens, etc. Faced with a clear, unambiguous statement of will and force, it seems to me that Putin's personality would just say, okay, well, that direction's blocked, let's try something else. Whereas he's not been faced with that. He's been faced with extreme ambiguity and a failure to exert any sort of will, I think, by NATO for a decade or so.
I think that yes, there's a great deal of misunderstanding on both sides of this, because Putin does tend to think that I believe he does tend to see NATO as being, controlled by these dark forces of Washington. And in that perception, I think the worst possible thing you can do is for a decade or even more, give these promises to Ukraine that Ukraine's going to be part of NATO in public and keep, affirming our resolve. And then not, but actually inside the organization, full well that you're not going to deliver on this. This destabilizes and causes both Putin to escalate, but also gives false hope to forces within Ukraine who start also believing in this and thinking if we can just convince them and if we can just show our own resolve, then we've got it made. It reminds me of this episode in The Office when Michael, the boss, he makes a promise to a bunch of kids at a school that he's going to pay for college, because he's, in this mood of he wants to be generous, he wants to show how much he cares, he wants to do the right thing. Of course, 10 years later, when these kids graduate, he has no money to send them to college, and he has to basically show up and explain this to a bunch of students who are there welcoming him and say, "Yay, you're going to send us to college." Um, it really resonated with me, this episode, because I happened to be watching it precisely in late 2021, watching how these promises, the effect that they had in destabilizing, elite forces, destabilizing elites, government elites in both countries. I think that, absolutely, you need a sense of clarity. It's not so much necessarily a show of force, but you certainly need a sense of clarity, because when you're dealing with somebody who's driven as much by fear and who's operating in a system that is tremendously, how should I put it, precarious to his own, existential survival, clarity is the basic thing that you need to, it's I would say it's probably the best deterrent. Now, in 2014, I think the issue was not so much necessarily that there was lack of resolve and lack of show of, that we're going to do this if you don't. As I wrote, I think one of the considerations was actually the belief that once Crimea had been annexed, well, once it had been secured, the West would actually stop at nothing to punish Russia, and so it doesn't really matter what we do. So, in other words, there was this false belief that, in fact, among some sectors of the Russian government, that look, we need to act more forcefully because the West is gonna won't forgive this. They'll try to destroy us. They were looking for any pretext to try to destroy us. They're certainly going to do this now.
But then, of course, the response, it depends who you speak to, but the response seems to have been quite insipid. In fact, business as usual, after some sort of, symbolic sanctions, seem to be the order of the day. So you've got the Moscow elite bracing themselves for this tsunami of loathing and punishment, but it doesn't seem to come. Does that then embolden them to go further, or are we on almost a kind of accidental slide that once you go with Crimea and that sets a precedent, clearly there's the huge wave of popular support behind that, and Putin's flagging popularity ratings have a boost which lasts a number of years. And the sort of memory of Bolotnaya, you're able to sort of stamp on that and put that into the background. Does this set a precedent for almost, I don't want to use the word inevitable, but it sets a precedent for trying to use the mechanism of warfare to prop up, as you say, the fragility of the internal regime?
Um, here's an interesting thing. Now, the idea that after 2014, the West did not go far enough and it was business as usual, and oh, the Russians got away with it. This is something I heard from Western officials, think tankers, and analysts. From the Russian side, I never heard them say this. I heard the opposite. What I was hearing increasingly, not in 2014 so much as in, let's say, 2017, 2018, 2019, but this was like, it was mounting, was that, look, no matter what we do, sanctions are just going to keep piling up. And what really got me worried was when I began to hear this kind of fatalism from the most pro-business, pro-Western sectors of the Russian elites. And that's an interesting, I think this is very interesting to bear in mind how the Western response, how differently it was perceived on the ground. We may think we did very little and not enough, and but in Russia's case, this was not that we did so little that then and it then emboldened them to act. From their perspective, we did so much that they felt cornered and they reacted. I mean, I'm just saying this is a perspective that I
Mm.
hear in Moscow from those close to the government, and I'm not saying it's an accurate one, but this is how they see it.
And there's an interesting tendency now. This is where I'm gonna make the fatal mistake here of trying to interpret Putin's mindset again. It seems to me there's a certain sort of I would almost label it a kind of a toddler mindset here, which is, if you are hurling abuse at him, at least you're paying attention. What Putin can't stand is irrelevancy. Um, if he's not part of the global system, if Russia isn't given the sort of accorded status as a great power and isn't, able to sort of strut on the stage and so on, that does seem to irk him. Is it possible that this is a wider phenomenon amongst the elite in general, that actually being sort of irrelevant and ignored could be exacerbating this sense and combining, the sanctions and so on? But firstly, is that a definable part of Putin's mindset, or is it difficult to say?
Again, I would venture with caution to what degree he feels this, but I would say, I mean, look, common sense tells us that anybody, even the most, emotionally mature human being, would probably be a bit miffed if he was told that he's irrelevant and not important. I mean, let's ask ourselves honestly, how would we feel? I think that, while the Kremlin's and Putin's views of NATO expansion and how, unfair it was. There's a great deal of exaggeration there, but that said, the way it was conducted, without consulting Russia, without really asking, that left a mark that could have been easily avoided. Um, I heard a Western official admitting that when the United States pulled out of the AMB treaty in 2002, some European diplomats said, well, why don't you really can maybe this is something you want to talk to Putin about, just to, let him know and discuss this. And the answer was no, we don't want to make them feel important. Um, this is one of those things that it might feel right at the moment. Why would you want to make somebody who feel important if you don't like them? Well, it can come back at you, and it's something that is actually easily remedied. You can still get your way. You can still show a certain sense of force, while also being big enough to you know inform and bring your adversary and just keep them in the loop.
Is there then a substantial difference between the way he may be able to sort of converse, discuss, or negotiate with people like Erdogan, those who are powerful individuals who have, dare I say it, less democratic checks within their system, so they're able to perhaps sort of go beyond what some democratic leaders are and actually engage in these more sort of informal power dialogues and sort of convey that. Have we sort of pushed him into, um, let's say, sort of choosing the path of really negotiating with Orban, Assad, and these kind of characters, or does that fit better with the kind of sort of impersonal power relations that Putin's built in his own system?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's easier to deal with pragmatic autocrats than it is with what elected Western leaders who need to sound like they're always doing the morally right thing in order to get reelected. This is for better or worse, this is a problem he doesn't have to deal with when dealing with Erdogan. This is why Turkey has proven to be such an interesting say frenemy. I mean, this is not exactly an ally. This is a NATO country, but I think there are several things going on. I mean, apart from the similarities, there's also simply just that regimes or rulers that are basically clear about what they want and what their interests are, and they're not trying to be holier than thou and saying, oh, no, no, we stand for all the right values. They're just doing what needs to be done for their own in their own interests, even when those interests go at odds with Russia's. I mean, we have to remember that Russia and Turkey are on opposite sides of, the Syria conflict. This simply makes it easier for the Kremlin to deal with such actors. I mean, I would wager it makes it easier on some level for anybody to deal with people who are clear about their intentions and whose interests you can rely on. And I think that this is the trouble when there's this inherent unreliability in Western resolve. This only breeds the paranoia. What are you actually up to?
And there may be a certain sort of projection there as well. This is how I deal with my colleagues, this is how I deal with, my pyramid of power and those countries in my sphere of influence. It doesn't quite translate. Well, let's turn to Donbass, because I think what's absolutely fascinating is, you know, I've been talking extensively on this podcast about how that was an invasion. Right from the start, it's clearly an invasion. It's not entirely organic, homegrown, domestic insurgency, and without outside assistance and influence, it's my belief that that wouldn't have, there'd have been problems, but perhaps they'd have been dealt with on an internal civic level. It wouldn't have escalated the way it did. But at the same time, what I found fascinating about your book is the informality behind some of this, that it can still be an invasion, but it can be a kind of hybrid invasion. It can be, I think I labeled it here, innovations in violence. It's almost like you're trying out different business models in how to exert power, influence, and so on. Let's start talking about that. What are the different components of that, and how far was it sort of outsourcing as opposed to a state operation?
I think there's a great deal of outsourcing. Now, this started with the Crimea operation when that outsourcing was deliberate and indeed part of the whole kind of planned operation was that we rely on local forces. We rely on the popularity of the cause, which was indeed in Crimea was pretty big. I mean, I was there during the annexation. Yes, there was a minority that opposed it, but generally people were pretty united in their sense that we want to join Russia. Um, Now the thing is that what happened later was different. The success in Russia's annexation of Crimea created a certain expectation among the volunteers it had relied on, the non-state actors, the various rogue forces, people like Igor Girkin, who led a security unit in Crimea. It created this expectation that why don't we go further and repeat this in Donbas? And the Kremlin at that point, I think in here, this is the key misunderstanding. I think that we like to assume in the West that this is all part of some, coordinated campaign to pull the wool over our eyes. That the Kremlin was, maneuvering all of these various actors to create a sense of deniability, and it had this big plan. All
Like
of this was
4D chess kind of thing.
exactly, exactly. When in fact, even with Crimea, which was a far, better planned operation, even with Crimea, there is no evidence of what exactly they were looking at and aiming to achieve until after. I mean, the actual uh, operation to secure the peninsula came with a certain consideration of the possible outcomes, but they were still, there wasn't a full decision of what to do afterwards. Do we immediately call a referendum for independence? Do we call a referendum for rejoining Russia? There were all sorts of things that were being debated up until the very last minute. With Donbass, it was even more complicated. There's this very hotly debated topic of Igor Girkin going into Donbass, and that that this was somehow coordinated with the Kremlin. Uh, there is there was some coordination, certainly with Russian government officials that were very much in favor of this operation, but there was no consensus in the Kremlin about whether this was a good idea. And there is evidence that by the time Girkin actually crossed the border into Ukraine and went just days before he took Slavyansk, he was told to call it off by his handlers, and he defied these orders. In fact, he had his phone switched off. Now, again, uh, what exactly happened? I mean, I tend to lean with this because there's a lot of other evidence on the ground that supports the idea that this was a very improvised operation. That nobody was really. I mean, let's put it this way: the separatist insurgents in Ukraine were expecting Girkin in the sense that they had hoped that this would happen all along. They watched what happened in Crimea and they were overjoyed, and they were just thinking, now finally they're going to come and liberate us. So, they expected Girkin in that regard. They didn't expect in terms of, the preparation, and, that element was missing, which suggests to me that this version about indecision was probably the more accurate one.
And two questions have come out of that. One is, as well as Girkin, who clearly has these connections with, as you say, influential people within the Kremlin, but also the security services, the intelligence services. He's got these kind of either formal or informal connections there, but it's not clear, as you say, whether he's under orders or whether it's almost a personal initiative or based on his personal beliefs. But what other networks, what other groups of people are involved here? And what can we say about their connections to the Russian state? So this could be, oligarchs, industrialists, people who control various means of production, wealth, perhaps to influence, their workers or their own networks, various sort of mafia informal networks. What are we looking at here? Are we looking at quite a lot of elements that kind of came together? Is it fairly chaotic, or is this something that Gherkin and his small group, really, we can pin it all on them?
Well, Girkin likes to say that he was the trigger man of the Russian Spring. I think that he tends to exaggerate his role, obviously. Look, I think that we need to look at two sides to this equation. We can't really discount that there were both business and all sorts of different elements on the ground in Donbass, Ukrainian citizens who were feeling this and were indeed calling on support from their Russian sympathizers. In Russia, I would say that, aside from Girkin, who is a, ex-FSB, there were a lot of veteran unions who were very much enthusiastic about this. There were elements within the FSB, who allegedly did this in their free time. There were there among business. Well, there was Konstantin Malafeyev, closely connected to Girkin, um, who genuinely believed in the idea of Novorossiya and the idea of unification of what he thought to be, what he believed to be indeed Russian land, Russian culture. Um, and willing to put up money for it, and believing also that his interests and his beliefs and his agendas aligned with the interests in the Kremlin. And for that, you needed certain officials in the Kremlin. One of them was Sergei Glaziev, who also were believers in this endeavor. You had people like certain parliamentarians who were also very avid supporters of this movement, who did what they could to convince the Kremlin, to be much more robust than it actually ended up being in 2014.
There's an interesting spectrum, isn't there? And it
Yeah.
sounds like Putin could be in the middle of this, maybe, indecisive, not really taking a lead here, because he could have come and said, okay, if we're going to do this thing, we're going to do it properly. Maybe that would align more with someone like Patrushev, who's more of an ideologue. Right? If we're going to do it properly, we're going to send the army in. We're not going to rely on ragbag kind of mercenaries, privateers, and so on. Let's do this properly and do it now. That's one extreme. The other extreme, you've got Surkov, which is more of the smoke and mirrors, the Potemkin facade of, hybrid warriors and so on. And it's
Mm.
like, well, we're not really going to do this thing full scale, but we're going to make people believe we are. And it's just all a kind of puppet theater. Um, is this a reasonable characterization of the two extremes, with Putin just sort of saying, okay, well, let's just see what people are going to do and see how it works. I'm not going to make any plans myself, but if it works, then we'll go with it. If it fails, then we can deny that we were ever part of it.
The interesting paradox is that Surkov was not really a big driver of policy here. He was an actor. He was somebody who basically this landed on his desk, and I heard that this was a punishment for him that he had sided with Medvedev over Putin in the 2012 elections. So it's not like this is somehow all engineered in Surkov's head. It might sound very Surkovian, but that said, this was somebody who was basically got this, project after it was on the verge of failing, and told do something with it. And if you look at intercepted phone calls between Surkov and some of the some of the insurgency leaders in Donbas, he's saying things like, well, I know you have a defense minister, but we've got somebody else from Moscow. Maybe you can have two defense ministers. I'm thinking, I mean, in what universe is that a good idea? You know, um, so you have to say that Putin is in the middle of this and kind of, that I mean, I think he certainly has a lot of agency in this, and he certainly could have made two choices. One, like you said, he could have done this properly, as his generals, some of them were, expecting him to do. Or he could have basically gone, like, when he started calling off the separatists, like kind of try, telling them to curb their enthusiasm in early May of 2014. He could have gone further, and he could have actually, stopped them from going there and said, look, this is not in the interests of the Russian-speaking population of Eastern Ukraine that we certainly want to help and we certainly support, but this is not the best way to do so. He could have done this, but he chose not to. Um, so I think that the reasons for that, one of them at least, was that again, he feared backlash from his own security forces, who were very supportive of this project, so he couldn't really call them off. Nor could he invade, because again, he feared the Western response. that he would, and also that he would be getting into a quagmire that he wouldn't be able to get out of, which is ironic given what he did 8 years later.
So he's not quite a Paruchikije. He's not like a hollow, empty space where things happen around him. But you're suggesting that by not making decisive decisions, by not favoring one faction over another, it's almost like he's swept along. But it does suggest here, if we look at it as a kind of accidental escalation, that by coming to rely on more extreme forces, because of the relative fragility of your regime or the fact you've got competing interests. And sometimes it's easier to let the more extreme elements have their way because they keep the less extreme ones in check, and they keep the so-called liberals down as well. It makes it almost sound like there is a certain inevitability about it, but it's not a decisive inevitability. It's almost like if you fail to control the situation, if you fail to control these factions, you're gonna be dragged towards the extremes, and this is where the extremes lead you.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, again, it's not there's a certain pressure when you unleash these forces and expect them to do exactly what you want them to do. That creates certain expectations within these forces and within society that you might not be prepared to actually deliver. That creates certain risks, and it also creates certain pressure. You become boxed into the agendas of these people that you backed. Um, and you're right. There's a certain, on some level, inevitability to where this leads, but again, it didn't have to lead to this war. Even at the very end, there were decisive steps that he could have taken that indeed we were hoping. Sorry, not hoping. I wasn't certainly hoping that a lot of Russian supporters of the Novorossiya projects were hoping that this would lead to recognition and possibly annexation. But again, this was the support for that scenario was that was more about legally recognizing and then legally annexing them rather than some kind of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is why it was so perplexing. I think he still could have done that. Um, and he would not have faced the kind of catastrophic scenarios that I think were being thrown around within the Kremlin.
And another aspect of this, perhaps either indecision or maybe even lack of imagination, or choosing the path of least resistance. I think you sort of allude to it being more like that in the book. And this is the identity of Russia. This is the top-down version of Russia's identity, which, of course, as you said, has chosen the most perhaps lazy and destructive form, the most toxic form, which is this sort of genocidal imperialism. But that's not the only identity that was available. Others might have been far harder to implement. They were required a certain thinking and a certain amount of strength and decision making. Is it true here to say that actually where we've ended up with this, the worst possible incarnation of Russia, if we go back and look historically, is this also almost like an accidental slide because of the lack of vision, leadership, and imagination?
Yes, I think so. I mean, look, I have a bit of a problem with the idea that Russia is somehow destined to repeat these imperialistic, that it is imperialist at heart and it is always seeking to expand and subjugate. I really think that's a problematic assessment of its history. It is understandable, especially coming from, smaller constituencies that were part of this empire and what had suffered under it, but it is also not really helpful in looking for ways out of this conflict. Again, it boxes us into this inevitability that Russia is going to be this, this is bigger than Putin. This is something about the whole of Russia. And I find that deeply problematic on a number of levels. First and foremost on this practical level. Okay, what are the ways out of this? If we look at this conflict for what it is, I mean, it is complicated. There's no doubt about it. It has a lot of complexities. There's the issue of NATO, Ukraine joining NATO. There's also the issue of the rights of Russian minorities in Ukraine, and the sense of duty that certain sectors of the Russian government feel that they have. Now, this was a genuine kind of sense that we need to support Russian minorities in Ukraine, and just as we do in other um, former Soviet republics. That said, the reason the Kremlin ultimately did what it did was not anything near. It was never about supporting them. It was about whatever it was trying to figure out in its own, vertical of power. Um, so again, I think that looking at the difficult practicalities of this conflict, and just how much nuance and how much complexity there are potential alternatives to every step of the way. And I think that as dark as it is right now, as inevitable, and as and this really saddens me, because currently it is very hard to see a way out of this. I think that assuming the worst uh, doesn't really help us look for options out, and doesn't really strengthen um, resolve to work ourselves out of this uh, incredibly dangerous conflict.
I'm guessing as well that there must have been this sense of almost doom and inevitability prior to Stalin's death, or even upon Stalin's death. The sense that this could easily repeat. You might have Beria or someone taking charge, and then you've got the same stuff happening with the same kind of intensity and monstrosity. Whereas actually, there was a lot of terrible things that happened, but actually there was a certain easing of those tensions and a change of direction. So I absolutely sort of can appreciate that none of this is inevitable. What also is interesting, I think, is maybe Putin's mindset, because we tend to label things, don't we? Liberal, nationalist, etc. We put fairly broad labels on things. I wonder if Putin doesn't really see these labels, or see the idea that there's any organic politics at all. So when he sees so-called liberal groups in Russia, or he sees this faction or that faction, what he's actually seeing is cynically people who simply want a piece of the pie. It's his pie at the moment, and it belongs to him and his friends. And whatever labels they give themselves, maybe he cynically projects, well, they just want to become me. They just want to do what I've done here. I stole all this. They're doing the same. And in that sense, he may not actually have an ideological position. He's simply working through these sort of power relationships. Or do you think through his tenure, he's perhaps gone from really not being an ideologue, and he's actually sort of perhaps caught aspects of genuine belief in some kind of values, which may have led to him launching the full-scale war?
That's a good question, and ultimately, it still holds that, how far we can. This is knowable. But I think that this is the interesting thing, that throughout his whole tenure, he was there was a certain hollowness, an ideological hollowness behind his rule. And to fill that, in 2012, when he came back and he saw that society was demanding a belief in something, he started leaning on these forces that believed in something that he thought would he could base his rule on. Um, and I think that, however he did that, I think that that hollowness remained. And I think what happened was, in sometime in 2021, one theory is that, the isolation of COVID brought him really close to some of his most reactionary advisors, and he was just mired in these conversations about Russian history, about the deterministic nature of Russian uniqueness, all of these things that, reinforced a certain sense of inevitability, a false sense of inevitability. And I don't know if that actually turned him suddenly into an ideologue, but I think he started feeling like, okay, maybe it's time to believe in something. Maybe it's time, maybe I need, we all need to believe in something. And as we age, I think that becomes more and more important and, harder to resist. And he somehow fell into this. There was a joke going around in Moscow in the fall of 2021, or well, right after the, you know, actually later, no, when the after the full scale invasion, that for so long Russia had refused to annex the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics until they annexed Russia. And this is what happened, those kind of retrograde pseudo Soviet style republics that they kind of wanted to recreate. It just kind of spread to Russian, you know took the Kremlin with them.
It's the tail wagging the dog on a grand scale, and Girkin certainly expands his role in the telling of that story, doesn't he?
Yeah,
That's what he implies when he describes this.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and the last question here is Putin then clearly has outsourced this insurgency. It's grown into something that he's had to deal with, and perhaps made some catastrophic miscalculations along the way. Have we also not learned something that no matter how big the role someone like Gherkin, Prigozhin, or others play, um, we think of the blogger in St. Petersburg as well, whose name I can't quite recall. No matter how important and indispensable all these characters believe they are, what we've actually learned over the last 2 years is no one apart from the head guy is expendable. I mean, everyone has their role on the stage, and then when their part is played, there's no compunction in taking them out when they're no longer useful to the regime.
Um, well, if you mean to say that the non-state actors are not expendable, I would say, I mean, I think they are expendable. And I think this is the trouble,
Oh yeah,
is
that's what I
that
mean. Yeah, they're
yeah,
entirely expendable when their usefulness is expiring.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is the trouble, is that when you lean on people, because they believe in something, whatever it is they believe in, but they believe in it, and they believe that they're right, and then you kind of treat them as, you know, you take them out once they start, getting their own ideas about what it is they want based on their beliefs. Well, you've kind of exposed your own hollowness, and this is the problem. And I think that this was the problem of the Prigozhin mutiny. On the one hand, you have this person who, certainly not a lot of people support. I mean, he's made a lot of enemies, Prigozhin. I mean, but on the other hand, he's saying things that everybody on some level believes already. And I think that this is going to, it's an interesting feature of Putin's rule that we're going to keep on seeing. And even though right now the Kremlin is trying to kind of rein in these like especially the PMCs that have proliferated in wake of Wagner, he's trying to kind of rein them back in under the control of the MOD. It's going to be really interesting to see the after effects of this reliance on other people's initiative and other people's belief without fully buying into it. So I'm really curious to see how that turns out.
That'll always be a threat. I always thought of Prigozhin as a bit of an unholy fool, someone
Mm,
ghastly but talking truth to power, because you say it had a
mm.
ring of authenticity and truth behind all he said. It is going to be fascinating, and yeah, let's. I won't even ask about predictions because we're, I think, on a
Yeah,
hiding to nothing there. Um,
yeah,
but
exactly.
I strongly recommend people check out the book. It's got, I think, extraordinary details. It's important to understand the sources and the lead up to the war because it may well tell us something about how to fight the Putin regime and how this might actually end up. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We'll pop a link in the description. But Anna, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, thank you so much, and thank you for your insightful questions.